Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. I want to welcome you to our first webinar, and we're delighted to have Heidi Beirich with us, who's the head of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, to talk about hate and COVID-19. Before Heidi starts, I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about the Bard Center for the Study of Hate and why we're here today and why we're doing a program like this. The Bard Center for the Study of Hate, of course, is at Bard College. It's part of its human rights program. And the premise of hate studies, which is the core of what we do, is defined as inquiries into the human capacity to define and then to dehumanize or demonize an other, and the processes which inform and give expression to, or can curtail, combat, or control that capacity. And the premise is that we really know too little about hatred. We know that we're predisposed to seeing us versus them historically, regardless of where or when or what culture or politics or any other variable, but we know too little about it. We do know that certain things can exacerbate it. And I think, many of us would agree that now we're in a time where many of those things that exacerbate hatred exist. For the last 20 years, we've seen a movement for the creation of hate studies, which is started at Gonzaga University, led by Christine Hoover now, with a focus on hate studies, and our colleague Brian Levin at the Center for Study of Hate and Extremism in California, and our colleague Barbara Perry looks at hate crimes, and in particular as part of hate studies in Canada and internationally. So we're seeing a blossoming of the idea that we ought to pull together from different disciplines and create a better understanding of how hatred works, what we know from psychology and in the individual, what we know from politics, what we know from anthropology and sociology and other fields as well. And at Bard, we're trying to do something a little bit different. We're trying to energize the campus as a model of how to look at hatred and how to provide answers from what we know that have a real world impact. And I know that we have many people from different academic institutions beyond Bard on this call today, on this webinar. And I invite you at any time, not today, but after the webinar is over, if you want to email me or talk to me about how do you set up a hate studies center or some component of what we do, I'd be happy to walk you through it. A couple of things that we're doing at Bard. The faculty is really energized. We set up a reading group from faculty from a variety of different fields, from economics and political science and philosophy, social psychology and so forth, to read texts every 3 weeks from different fields of hate to inform their teaching. We have a list of classes that the faculty said, let's collect the classes that are already touching on hate. This spring, we have 70, believe it or not, in a small liberal arts college, from the arts to the hard sciences to the fields you would expect, sociology and so forth. And we're starting in the fall. The next step of this is to have actually a hate studies initiative in the formal course list. With some very generous funding from the GS Humane Corporation, we're promoting some research from faculty into hate, including in particular an economic cost of hate scale, so we know how much hate costs us, which hasn't been done before, funding for new classes, and then some consultations that we hope to do next year, both on looking at social media and how it could be used more effectively to combat hate, and then bringing together academics and people from NGOs, non-governmental organizations, other change agents who combat hate in the real world to be smarter about how they do it, how to take testable theories from the academy and use it. Also have student initiatives. I'm not going to go into those, but if you want to look into those at the Bard Center for Study of Hate website, bch.bard.edu, they're there. One part of that has been bringing public programs about hate to the campus. And of course, given COVID-19, we're no longer able to bring the speakers that we were having come to campus and meet with the students and talk to the faculty and the community. But the one, positive thing of this horrible situation we're all in is that it allows us to replace those public meetings with people that would have been expensive or difficult for us to bring into BARD and into the community to talk about these things, because now they just have to be on the other end of the computer. So I'm particularly delighted that the first one of these speakers that we're going to be able to bring in to share with the BARD community and beyond is Heidi Beirich, who's somebody I've admired and worked with for too long that either of us want to think about. But she's great. And what we're going to do is I'm going to log off my picture. You'll see Heidi. She's going to talk at the end. We'll have question and answers. There's a question and answer tab, so feel free to put in questions and I'll sort of call those for Heidi, and this should last about an hour. So let me give you a quick introduction of Heidi and then we'll begin. So Heidi Beirich is the co-founder and chief strategy officer of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. She's an internationally recognized expert on American and European extremist movements, including white supremacy, nativism, anti-Semitism, and anti-government movements. She earned a doctorate in political science from Purdue University and is the author of numerous academic publications on extremism. She's been interviewed by hundreds of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, and others. She appeared repeatedly on major television networks and in documentaries and radio programs exploring extremism. She's also testified before Congress on issues related to white supremacy, and for nearly a decade, she led the Southern Poverty Law Center's intelligence project. So Heidi, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with the BARD Center for Study of Hate today. I'm delighted that you're our first webinar, and I look forward to hearing what you have to share with our audience. So.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much. I want to thank you. I want to thank BARD for inviting me to come do this. I'm very happy to be here, although admittedly going to be talking about a bit of a scary topic, but it's very, very important. So what I'm going to discuss today is how hate issues relate to the current viral the breakout that we're facing right now. So hate and COVID and what this means. And just so you know a little bit about me, Ken has already said some of this. I was at the Southern Poverty Law Center for 20 years, the last 10 or so, either co-directing or directing the Intelligence Project, which is the part of the SPLC that tracks hate groups and extremists. And I left there at the end of December to start a new organization, the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, with the intention of trying to look beyond the domestic scene, because one of the things that I learned in my many years at SPLC is that unfortunately hate movements and extremists are very globalized, ironically, and very connected. And there's a lot of information about these movements that doesn't really exist in the public domain at this point. And so that's one of the things that our new project is going to work on. I put my email up there if anybody has any questions for me, and the website. I'd be happy to answer them either in the Q&A today or later on. So let me begin. I'm going to talk today about a few things that I'm most concerned about in the wake of the COVID outbreak. First thing has to do with the hate crime situation and threats to marginalized communities that have come with this terrible disease. Also, the spread of conspiracy theories. It doesn't seem like anything bad can happen in this country without anti-Semitism running rife and other types of conspiracy theories. I'll talk about how the situation is lending itself, unfortunately, to more domestic terrorism, which we've already seen too much of in recent years, and how the COVID outbreak is energizing populism and creeping authoritarianism, in some places straight up authoritarianism, across the world. So I admit this won't be an uplifting presentation, but it is what the situation has led to when it comes to hate and extremism. And I'll talk at the very end about things that we can all do to try to make this a better situation. So this just is Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, saying we are seeing stigma, hate speech, white supremacists, and other extremists seeking to exploit this situation. I think in one sentence, Guterres has put very, very succinctly what the problem is here with COVID. COVID has created an opening to some of our baser instincts, and extremists are exploiting those things to further their movements, further their agendas, build their groups up, and they're exploiting every kind of tool at their disposal to do that. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. We have a long history in the United States, but this could be said about a lot of other countries, about blaming disease on immigrants, on foreign populations. These are just some examples of how this has happened in the past. Irish immigrants were blamed for cholera. Mobs attacked the Irish in the 1850s. There were accusations that Chinese immigrants were responsible for just about every single disease, and that helped lead in the United States to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. In the 1890s, tuberculosis with typical anti-Semitism was seen as a Jewish disease. We've also had the Chinatown in Santa Ana, California, near Los Angeles in 1906 burned down as a result of fears about leprosy. So what these examples show us is that people can very quickly, if pushed in the right direction, use disease outbreaks as an excuse for mass violence, genocidal violence, and hate crimes. And this country has a long history of this happening. So this is one of the things that we have to be particularly concerned about today. We don't want to repeat that history. Now, that's not ancient history. A lot of the examples I just showed you were from the 1800s and into the early 1900s. But here you see examples that are much more recent. Like in 2003, businesses turning away Asian American customers as a result of that time of the SARS virus. Latinx Americans were scapegoated with H1N1 when that pandemic hit in Mexico. When the Ebola virus outbreak happened not that long ago, Africans were found themselves in the same boat. And that's the reason why WHO very quickly renamed the virus away from something that would refer to China or where the outbreak was assumed to have started, and gives it a name like COVID-19 because there's so much stigma associated with disease and marginalized populations, and you don't want to allow for another situation like that to occur. So one of the first things that happened, and it was absolutely predictable, is that there was a wave of anti-Asian hate crimes that broke out for people who simplistically have connected disease with China or Chinese. It's just as right after 9/11, there were some horrible hate crimes against Muslims here in the United States. This is the same thing that we're seeing right now. There's a reaction and a lashing out at folks that are viewed to have caused the pandemic. Some organizations out in California, Chinese for American Action, Asian Pacific Policy, San Francisco State University, and others actually started very early on to collect information on hate crimes. And in 2 weeks, this is starting like right at the end of March and early April, there were 1,100 incidents of various kinds of assault, harassment, shunning, etc., that they were able to document. And this is actually something that shows the types of hate crimes that people were experiencing, or hate incidences. People being barred from establishments, transportation, being coughed on, spit on, shunning, physically shunning people, a lot of verbal harassment, and also physical assault. So this is a very dangerous time right now, unfortunately, to be an Asian American, because certain people with hate in their hearts are targeting those folks and blaming them for the pandemic, and that is bleeding over into violence. And this is probably not going to stop for some time. The other thing that's happening right now is a whole lot of anti-Semitism. It appears that in the West, the oldest hatred rears its ugly head whenever there's some sort of a crisis. And once again, we're seeing anti-Semitism. So really the nature of hate crimes right now and hate violence that we're seeing is attacking Asian Americans in the United States and then going after the Jewish population. And this is the kind of stuff, I blocked out the name of the speaker here, that we're seeing all across hate sites. Jews are being blamed for the virus, in many cases on hate sites for creating the virus. Israel is being blamed for perhaps being the source of the virus, and the Jews are using the virus to get Gentiles sick, as you'll see right here. This stuff is proliferating at frightening rates across the web. And it's also leading to real world attacks. This is an example, when I worked at the Law Center, I lived in Montgomery, Alabama, so this was up the road from there. There were 2 synagogues hit in a couple of days with this kind of ugly anti-Semitism, which is what is fostered when you have anti-Semitism running rife on websites and whatnot, like what I just showed you. And some of the most prolific hate propagandists in the United States, like David Duke, that's who I have here, the former Klansman and state official in Louisiana, elected official. He has been using his Twitter feed, and Lord only knows why he still has a Twitter account, to push this idea of COVID and the pandemic being used to create, as he says, a Zio New World Order. That's one ugly example of his speech. Here's another one where he is blaming Jewish businessmen and Wall Street, always a stand-in for Jews, for these people like David Duke, as making money off of the COVID virus. And there are other forms of this. If you look at just about any of the white supremacists that I've been tracking for far too long, you're seeing the same kind of bigotry or anti-Semitism, racism popping up its head all over their public statements. This is from Mark Krikorian, who runs an organization called the Center for Immigration Studies that the Law Center lists as an anti-immigrant hate group. Just after the viral outbreak, he changed his little avatar to this picture of a Chinese flag replaced with coronavirus depictions. And what you have is, it's pure propaganda to demonize Asians. The new project that I'm working on is going to go beyond America's borders, and the reason for this is because a lot of these ideas aren't contained in one place or another. They spread virulently, and we see in this particular crisis that the same kinds of problems that we're having in the United States with people reacting to COVID are happening in other places. In Germany, there's been an outbreak of anti-Semitism and hate crimes, just like in the United States. You have a terrible situation in India where Muslims were already being demeaned as, for example, as not deserving of citizenship under the Modi government in India and from militant Hindus. And now the Muslim population is being accused of spreading COVID through the population in the same way that Asians are being targeted in the United States. And this, of course, leads to very dangerous situations. And this particular article where I got the headline was about a riot, a near riot in Jharkhand that happened. But there's been a lot of violence against Muslims, and the conditions are very similar to what we see in the United States. So I want to talk a little bit about what can make this kind of speech particularly problematic. We're concerned about racism and anti-Semitism and other forms of hate wherever it is that they might pop up. But there are a couple things that are particularly dangerous. And at the Dangerous Speech Project, they have put together a list, and I encourage everyone to check them out. They're really amazing. A list of the things that make hate speech more possibly to lead to genocide. In other words, they've studied genocides and looked at what the key factors are. And one of those things that they point to is dehumanization. So this is their description of dehumanization. And you will see that some of the things that they're talking about here are similar to the kinds of hate speech I've been pointing out, treating people as bacteria, for example, deadly. So the kinds of ugliness that we're seeing right now around COVID are actually much scarier than garden variety racism. Not to make light of this, but this has the potential to lead to a lot more violence. And one of the things that the Dangerous Speech Project points out is you need to have this kind of language, but it matters to who the speaker is. When the person pushing these ideas is influential, a person in a position of power, it makes the situation all the more dangerous. And so I point here to the fact that we saw for a while there that our president, Donald Trump, was calling COVID the Chinese virus. We've had other officials in this particular administration say things like the Wuhan virus, other comments. This is very serious. We should expect more from our elected officials and high officials, because when they endorse that kind of speech, dehumanizing speech around this kind of an issue, meaning a health issue, it can lead to a very dangerous outcome. I'll just point out that what we want to see is more like what Biden did, which is we need to take racism and coronavirus serious. And it would be nice if more people spoke out in that vein. Okay, I'm going to switch to discussing now issues around domestic terrorism that have come up in this context. So it's not just hate speech and hate crimes that we've seen, in particular anti-Asian and anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism that are popping up. We've actually had a couple of attempted domestic terrorist attacks inspired by the COVID situation. There was a white supremacist who wanted to bomb a hospital, attack the power grid. He was inspired by the idea that COVID was being treated in that particular area. We also had just literally, I think yesterday or the day before, this come up, which is a guy in Massachusetts wanted to blow up a Jewish nursing home, also over COVID issues. So we see the potential. Luckily, these two folks didn't get away with what they were planning, but we see the potential for mass violence being spurred on by people in this current environment, and that is of great concern. Another terrifying situation was that the FBI put out a warning not too long ago, based on lots and lots of online traffic, that white supremacists were actually suggesting that if somebody, another white supremacist, were to be infected by the coronavirus, that they should then use that as a bioweapon. In other words, go out and infect the populations that white supremacists don't like, people of color, Jews, etc. And although there's been no evidence yet that anyone has done this, I'll just say that the communities in which this was discussed are places where there have been a lot of arrests made for people committing crimes up to an attempted murder, for example. So it's something to be taken very serious, and it's not a joke. And I have to keep, wondering in my back of my head, I hope that most of the white supremacists out there don't have the means or the opportunity to do these things. But they're probably very happy that people of color in particular have been hit hard by COVID. And if they had their druthers, they would probably want to make that situation worse. And that's, to me, another very concerning aspect of this. So we have hate crimes, we have domestic terrorism, both of which I don't perceive as going away in some way, probably get more serious over time. We also have just a horrible situation online where misinformation about COVID, about marginalized communities and so on is spreading like wildfire, to the point where the mainstream platforms are really having a hard time even handling it. And the way that you motivate people to hate crimes and whatnot is you spread these lies and this horrible thinking, white supremacist thinking, on the web. And that allows people to be exposed to it and radicalized. You can also spread it on television. We have had people like Laura Ingraham talking negatively about China, far-right publications talking about China. Trump has used the China virus. Other conservatives have said Wuhan virus, Kung Fu flu. This is all part of what I was talking about in terms of the dangerous speech, where you are then endorsing and spreading these vile ideas. And there's some interesting and troubling parallels with the past. There's a broadcaster right now who named Rick Wiles, who's been talking about COVID being blamed on Jews for not following Jesus. And I have that on the left of this slide, and on the right, I have something that was published in a Jewish newspaper at the time that the Nazis were in control about typhoid. So the parallels are just a little bit too stark. And when people on television and other places are repeating these ideas, we're further radicalizing young people. And I worry actually quite a lot about the possibility of young white males who are spending a lot of time on their computers right now being exposed to information that could be devastating. We have coronavirus conspiracy theories, not just in the United States, but all over the world. I mentioned the situation for Muslims in India right now. Part of that material about Muslims is spreading through websites, which is not surprising, through Facebook. And white supremacists are being quite intentional about using messaging apps like Telegram, where they create group chats to spread their messages, and they're using this as a recruitment tool. And there've been this is an Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness from the state of New Jersey, a warning about online extremists exploiting the COVID situation to inspire their supporters to incite panic, target minorities and immigrants, and celebrate the deaths of their enemies. One thing that's quite interesting here is it's not just white supremacists, those kinds of extremists who are taking advantage of the situation. We're seeing the same thing with Muslim extremist groups like ISIS trying to use the COVID-19 situation to inspire supporters and spread their messages. So this is a problem across quite a few different types of extremism that exist out there. Facebook and Twitter, who have, especially in the case of Facebook, don't have most of their employees who are monitoring content anymore working, right? For the same reasons that many of us are staying home. It's becoming nearly impossible for them to deal with the spread of racist themes, language, lies about coronavirus, I mean, et cetera, you name it. It's becoming quite serious. The companies have said they are trying very hard to get rid of COVID misinformation, but the problem is that this stuff proliferates at rates that are sort of astounding. So what we're having is, I think about sometimes what this is like. Not only do we have extremism proliferating in a fragile situation, but with something that extremists can take advantage of, but we also have mass communication in a way that didn't exist in the past. One of the things people often talk about when it comes to Hitler in the 1930s is he took advantage of a new technology at the time, radio, right? To say whatever he wanted to say. We also had anti-Semites like Father Coughlin functioning here in the United States on radio. But he used that propaganda tool very specifically to spread his virulent anti-Semitism. And today, white supremacists have access to a technology that doesn't just beam out, but also allows the recipient to respond, right? It's a two-way communication. So it's all the more dangerous. The other thing extremist groups are doing is they're actually taking the crisis and using it as an opportunity to recruit in the real world. This is a headline from an article of fascist groups and racist groups in Europe who have been going around and basically giving food and supplies to their supporters, white people, as a way to build up their reputation. So they're engaging in sort of positive activities for their extremist communities and their potential supporters to build their support while the state is suffering and unemployment is up. So this is another thing that they're taking advantage of in this current situation. All right, so we have hate crimes, we have domestic terrorism, we have spreading misinformation and endorsements from mainstream political figures about ideas that are false. This is, a very volatile situation. But we also have something else going on, which is there are leaders, mostly in the Western world, but not entirely, who are taking advantage of this situation to basically take control as authoritarians. The scariest and most extreme situation has been Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has traded in anti-Semitism. Viktor Orban has aligned himself with fascist elements. He's rabidly anti-immigrant, anti-Roma. But his latest, I'll show you, there's a picture of him, but his latest move has been to have his Congress, his equivalent of the Congress, Parliament, give him unlimited powers to rule by decree. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who, when I heard that, got a little bit of a feeling of what happened with Hitler and Nazi Germany, where a democratic entity handed, authoritarian powers to someone. In this case, literally people who were voted in. So Orban actually has the power right now, if he wanted to throw journalists in jail who talk about COVID in a way that he doesn't want. A lot of other powers. This is a really scary situation, as Hungary has sort of ceased to be a democracy, at least for the time of the emergency, as Orban and his allies see it. We have a situation in the Philippines where President Duterte, who is a bit of a maniac, has signed legislation around COVID-19 that allows him to go after the media, to threaten online critics, essentially shut down free expression and access to information. And I think yesterday he started talking about the possible imposition of martial law. So he as well is taking advantage of this situation to go after the democratic system, such as it is in the Philippines. And we have some of this going on here as well. Trump talked about his ability to convene or unconvene Congress. He talked the other day about how he had, I can't remember his wording example exactly, but total power over the economy. So this crisis is bringing people to engage in activities that are quite threatening, potentially, to democracy. And it's a very concerning situation. So let's talk a little bit about the economic downturn as well, which has come with this virus crisis, and is probably going to stay with us a lot longer. I hope, than the virus itself as a potential threat to our lives and well-being. The reason I bring this up is because periods of extreme unemployment are almost always good. The mechanisms differ in different time periods and different situations, but almost always good for extremists or for far-right political movements. In 2008, when we had the housing crash that led to the rise of the Tea Party movement, and the Tea Party movement certainly wasn't all racist, but racists flocked to it. There were some racialized elements to that movement. And it may be that we see the same thing here. Also, I was tracking hate groups for the Southern Poverty Law Center at that time, and we saw spikes in those organizations in the years following the recession. They were probably partly related to that and partly related to the fact that we had elected our first African-American president, which also had white supremacists on edge. But this will, again, be a situation that they will take advantage of. We're already seeing some bizarre things happening. One, there have been more guns purchased just recently. That you have to go all the way back to when Obama came into office in January of 2009 to see that kind of gun sales. So that shows you that people are extremely panicked. A lot of folks in the anti-government movement are pushing people to get guns, to get ammo. They're worried about societal breakdown and they want people to protect themselves. But this usually indicates rising interest in far-right movements, particularly anti-government movements. So we may see spikes in groups like that. We have seen some folks who are leaders in that movement come back up to the fore. Ammon Bundy, whose father was involved in Nevada, Cliven Bundy, in a huge standoff with federal officials a few years ago. You guys might remember the Bundy Ranch standoff. He was then involved in the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Facility in Eastern Oregon in 2014. And now Ammon Bundy and his crew are defying stay-at-home orders. So he's got himself back in the news and claiming that liberty is under threat for these measures that are being taken to deal with COVID. We've also had, and this is literally in the last week, a series of organizations pop out seemingly out of nowhere conservative organizations, some of you might have seen the protests that took place over the weekend, that are claiming that the lockdown orders to reduce the spread of COVID are illegal and shouldn't be allowed to continue. So they've started these things. This is a Facebook group for North Carolina, Reopen North Carolina, and it was only open a week when I took the snapshot a few days ago, and they had 33,000 members in that short period of time. I know that a lot of folks who were involved in the Tea Parties are popping back up in these groups. That kind of organized mechanism is reinvigorating itself here. We've now seen protests in Ohio, in Virginia, and various other places. And this is an example of a group, that teaparty.org, that's been around since 2008, maybe even 2007, pushing ideas about how, you have to stop the lockdowns that are helping us get control of the virus. And there are recall movements in play right now against Democratic governors by these new organizations. There's these Reopen groups, and they have kind of an extraordinary amount of support. This is a petition on change.org that's only been up for a very short period of time, and it already has 244,000 people signing on to recall Governor Whitmer in Michigan. Similar things are happening in other places. In particular, these movements are targeting Democratic governors, like in Virginia, like Whitmer. And in that sense, they're not going after Donald Trump at this point, because this is likely Donald Trump's base in many respects. But it is a growing political movement, and it may become a factor in the months ahead. All right, so I don't want to only speak about negative things. I want to talk a little bit as well about what all of us can do in this situation. And there are some concrete things. Some of them might seem very obvious, but they still matter. The first thing is we always have to keep in mind the victims. So we have to speak out against hate crimes, speak for the victims, and do what we can to support efforts to highlight that problem and make sure that communities, in particular the Jewish and the Asian American communities, are protected right now. I would anticipate that as this crisis continues for some time, there will be more and more attacks like we've already seen against members of these communities. So they very much need to be protected, and they need to be supported. I think it's important for all of us as well to speak out where we can. There are a lot of social media campaigns going on right now. I know there's one by Free Press to not allow hate to spread like a virus at the same time as the virus is spreading. So that's something else that matters. I also think that we all need to educate ourselves on this situation because we don't want these negative trends to get worse, right? We don't want to see a furthering of any of these things into the future as the pandemic continues and as the economy declines. And that's a real worry that we could see, the terrible things that have happened in past eras and situations like this rearing their ugly head. And then there's just some basic things that people can do. Get educated about the situation, speak out, vote. We have an opportunity. Hopefully, the elections are safely done over the coming months, where there are primaries, and then in the fall, to reject sort of policies that you find yourself not liking. And we should be speaking out in places like letters to the editor and online and other ways to reject things like using the term Chinese virus, or to tell Facebook and Twitter and whatnot that they shouldn't allow that kind of extremism to proliferate on their platforms. So I think these are all very important things that we can be doing to make the world a better place and try to minimize the fallout from this obviously horrific situation. We should be focusing, instead of having to focus on hate, unfortunately, it would be nice if we could be focusing on the medical situation and the folks who are sick, but this has come along with it. So with that, I will send it back to Ken and answer any questions people might have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heidi, for for participating and for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been incredibly helpful. What I'm going to do is encourage, if more people want to ask questions, I will call some of them. A couple of them are very easy, and I could actually answer. Whether this presentation is going to be made available online, yes, it will. Everybody who's participated today will get a link. It'll also be up on the Bard Center for the Study of Hate website, so you could share it with others as well. So I guess it sort of tracks what people are learning about the spikes in the virus itself. One person asked, are there any data on spikes in hate crime on minority groups or anti-Semitic crime yet? If so, how much delay is there between the events and the spikes?
There's almost, unfortunately, no data at this point about this, right? The information that's being collected from those groups out in California, they're doing it in real time. There's actually some Harvard students that have created a map, but these are probably not going to be, well, I think actually Ronald Lauder started a project yesterday also to collect information on hate crimes, but we're probably going to have no idea how that data correlates to specific events until quite a bit in the future. And frankly, the FBI won't release hate crimes data for 2020 until November of 2021. Unfortunately, we just don't have real-time data that can tell us specifically about these things. I wish we did, but we don't. At least folks are collecting data, though. This happened after the election in 2016 in November. Organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, the SPLC, and a whole host of others, including ProPublica news organizations, collected a ton of data on hate incidents that broke out then, but it took some time to analyze, and the FBI's data didn't come out for, I don't know, a year and a half afterwards to sort of verify the trends that we had all seen, which at that time was an uptick in hate crime.
Right, thank you. So there are a couple that are related, so let me actually bunch them together. One is seeing libertarian and adjacent right-wing groups accusing public health measures of being, quote, Nazis. So, using that Nazi image about people that are right-wing, using it against, governors who are closing down to save people's lives. And related to that is, what do you make of recent reports that extreme conservative groups or right-wing groups are backing or supporting groups protesting against the COVID-19 restrictions? You talked about some of that, but could you talk a little bit more?
Yeah, we saw swastikas directed at state officials at the rally that happened in Michigan this weekend. Also, Confederate battle flags were there, I think expressing a different sentiment. I think it's rather disgusting to use Nazi imagery against people who are simply in a very difficult time trying to keep us safe, right? There is no similarity between the Nazi regime and these state lockdowns, but that imagery is finding its way into the public domain. Initial research is showing that these protests might be a little bit more orchestrated than they appear. In other words, there might be some big financiers. I saw a report this morning about Koch money maybe going into this, that this might not be as grassroots as it looks. But I have to say that the idea that this is some kind of a Nazi effort on the part of medical officials to try to shut down the economy in some sort of venal way other than to save lives is outrageous, and it should be condemned. And I can't remember if it was the ADL or a different agency that made exactly that point, right? Don't use Nazi imagery in that case.
Great, thank you, Heidi. So here's another one. You've used the term dangerous speech. Is there a difference between this and hate speech? Does dangerous speech include extremist or hate speech?
Yeah, dangerous speech is a narrower concept, and I would encourage everybody to go to the dangerousspeech.org website. Suzanne Benish is the executive director of that particular group. It's narrower than hate speech, and what it is trying to get at is what kind of speech has led to mass violence. A lot of societies have people who engage in racism and other forms of hatred. The question for the Dangerous Speech Project is, when does that activate into violence? So they have a list of 6 or 7 different things I mentioned two of them, dehumanizing speech as being key, but there are other things that have to go along with that to lead to something like, for example, happened in Rwanda with the genocide, or in other cases like that. The nature of the speaker, for example. So I'd encourage people to look at that. The folks at the Dangerous Speech Project, of course, concerned about hate speech in general, but what they're really worried about is when does that begin to translate in violence, and how does that process occur?
Right. And I just want to add too that the people from the Dangerous Speech Project, working very closely with the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, we had one of Susan's colleagues, Kathy, come and speak at Bard, and not too long ago in January or February, and we anticipate doing more. So if you look at our website too, you'll be able to find some of their information about that as well. So here's another one. What about the treatment of Africans in China? There was an article in the Times today about that. The discrimination, hatred, and crimes committed against Africans in China. The Chinese are accusing the Africans of causing the virus. This is an issue of concern for the African Union. And, it's to put a little bit of an addition to that too. I mean, we've seen it in other places too, not just the places where there have been problems with, demonizing or dehumanizing immigrants for a long time now in Europe. I mean, we even saw some of the xenophobia between states in the United States as well. So how does this, fear and scapegoating equate in your view?
Well, I could have easily included that here as well, right? The point is that for some reason, we as human beings, and I'm sure this is what, BARD is spending its time studying, when something like this happens, it's as though we need to find a population that is marginal enough, that is easier to attack, to blame for the virus, right? So the situation that's occurring in China is that Africans have become that scapegoat in the same way that Jews and Asians in the United States have become that scapegoat. It's the same process of trying to assign blame and then making that population that you've assigned blame to the target of violence, shunning, whatever the case might be, right? It's the same exact thing. And I'm sure that's exactly what Bard's up to looking at. It's like, why do we as humans keep engaging in the same processes? In the West, Jews are targeted for, damn near every single thing that ever happens, right? It's a long-standing, many thousand-year-long process of demonization. And what we're seeing in China right now is the same as being directed at Africans. These processes, unfortunately, play themselves out over and over and over again.
Okay, thank you. So here's another one. So political speech is the most protected one, whereas politicians are the ones who reach most people and are most influential. So if they incite hatred, see the anti-Soros, anti-refugee campaign by Orban, which you addressed, they'll have huge impacts on public discourse and even contribute to the proliferation of hate crimes. How would you resolve that tension?
Well, I agree with that as a statement. That's exactly what's happening. I mean, look, in the United States, this is a very difficult situation. We have the First Amendment, which protects damn near everything that somebody says. I mean, up until you get to a true threat, like directly threatening another person. And if the threat is online, that's often protected speech as well. In other countries, there are different dynamics, right? You have laws against Holocaust denial and forms of hate speech in most European countries. So the tactic that I've taken here in the United States is to try to get private companies where this speech proliferates to take hate speech off their platforms. And a lot of the mainstream platforms have come a long way. That doesn't mean it's perfect, but Facebook has begun removing dangerous organizations, has tightened up its definitions of what can't be on the platform, and PayPal doesn't allow itself to be used anymore by Ku Klux Klan groups like it used to raise money. That's the process that I think has done the most to get rid of hate speech in the United States, where we don't have those laws. But the problem that you point out is a significant one. And it is very worrying when, television personalities, elected officials, the president of the United States say things that further hate. I mean, we should be responsible. We should not be doing that.
Let me add a little bit more to that, because I, fully agree with you in the question about it. But if you look back in time to 9/11, which was another tragic episode, to the American society and psyche and so forth. You had President Bush, whatever you thought about him, he came out and basically wrapped his arms around the Muslim community, right? And what you pointed out correctly here is that we have a president who seems to think that, with some reason, that he's going to succeed if he exacerbates divisions and blames outsiders, totally creating the us versus them paradigm on steroids. So, you had the one clip there, Biden putting out a statement against it, but we haven't seen, with all the governors speaking, and it's understandable, they're speaking about economics, they're speaking about health, those are the major things. But I haven't seen them doing the type of counter speech that I know Susan and others talk about, and you've talked about it, as necessary. So how do we put pressure on politicians to say, okay, this may not be the top thing, but it's of concern too, and you ought to show that you're in New York, or you're in New Jersey, or you're, in Michigan, or wherever, you're reaching out to these communities too, because that's part of what your job is.
I think it would be absolutely fantastic if some of us, any of us, were to start a campaign and have people like that, like the governors, other elected officials from both sides of the aisle, sign on and say that the one thing we're not going to do is let this change from a health crisis to a hate crisis, right? People speaking out at those levels can do a lot to tamp down, just as you proposed, to tamp down the negative sentiments. That Bush example, I can't believe it escaped me, was incredibly powerful. George Bush put an end to just a horrible set of hate crimes that were occurring then. And it was one of the things that I think a lot of us in the civil rights community after 2016 were begging Donald Trump at the time, when he was president-elect, to tell his supporters to not engage in hate. You can be extremely powerful. So that would be an amazing thing to, as a campaign, to have a bunch of elected officials just stand up and say that, we're not going to have that we're not going to let what is already a horrible crisis turn into something even worse, or continue, right? Because it's already starting with the violence.
Great. So let me ask you, because we have about 8 minutes left, so let me ask you a couple more. What makes this, if you could answer this, we could all, close up business and go home, but I'll give you a shot. What makes people hate others? Are all societies equally hateful? My guess is not. If I am correct, what are the circumstances that make some societies less hateful on the average and others more hateful on the average?
Oh my God, that's like 5 graduate school courses. Look, I don't know how I can't answer something that big picture. I can say that there are certain circumstances that can lead to more violence. If you already have a history in a country where a particular population has been demonized or oppressed, like the United States has vis-a-vis African Americans, the situation in most of the West with Jews has been this way, then you tend to have more of, you have things turn in this direction. But you can have that kind of hatred dynamics in all kinds of different societies and populations, Hutus and Tutsis being an example out of Africa. I think, and I'm sure this is something that Bard works on, is that there is a certain amount of in-group, out-group that may come with being a human being, right? And that needs to be better understood, the psychology of how these things work. But I mean, literally, there's no way I can answer.
Okay.
Maybe Bard can have that figured out within the next 12 to 18 months. It'd be great. Great topics for seminars.
It is. And we're going to have some people that are looking at the brain science and some social psychologists to look at trying to expand our understanding of precisely that. So I'm asking a couple more. This is from a friend who's a historian. So are there parallels in American history to the, quote, the internal xenophobia which we are experiencing that we can learn from? You had some of that at the beginning, but can you think of others that would relate to this current moment?
Well, the whole history actually of anti-immigrant activism in the United States, the whole process that led to us essentially shutting the United States down, except to only for white people in 1924 when the Immigration Act was passed. That whole process was one of blaming immigrants for disease and using that as a tool to shift racial dynamics in the United States. And that regime, that immigration regime, from 1924 lasted until 1965, where basically, quote unquote, Nordics were the only ones allowed in on a quota system to the United States. So anybody who wants to look at those dynamics should take a look at the history of immigration. I think we often like to think that at least since the 1960s or leading up to the 1960s, that we were bending the arc of history in a positive direction, as Martin Luther King talked about, that, this has been some sort of march to progress. But really, the history in the United States when it comes to immigration has been a lot of steps back before a step forward. So I would look at that. But there's also been discrimination against just about any non-white population and also women in this country. And because we're talking about disease issues, when disease rears its head, it gets slammed at the feet of those populations that don't have as much political power.
Thank you. So there have been conspiracy theories that Black and brown people are less susceptible to get COVID or immune to the virus, which is dangerous for these communities. Is there any evidence that white supremacy groups are discreetly propagating this theory or sentiment?
That is an interesting question, but I have not seen evidence. I've seen that this is spreading right through those communities, but no, I haven't seen anything from white supremacists at all on that front. And yes, there's dangerous conspiracy theories to some of these others, right? Because it could stop people from understanding they need to stay away from, socially distance and whatnot.
Right. So let me do a couple more and then we'll close up. And then for people that I haven't had a chance to, to ask the questions, I'll forward them to Heidi and we can do it offline. But you mentioned anti-government groups questioning preventative measures. Can you talk about the racial politics of anti-government groups? How much overlap is there between their anti-government positions and white supremacy?
Well, they are very, very distinct movements. The anti-government movement focuses on sort of the terrors of the federal government or, UN agencies, black helicopters coming to round people up. It's a conspiracy movement. There are strains of racism that run through parts of that movement, and it's a very white movement and very, obviously conservative movement. So that does pop up. Some of you might remember that Cliven Bundy, who was a hero of this movement, after and a hero actually to conservative politicians after the standoff, also went on a racist rant about black people, which kind of ended his prominence. But what we have seen in recent years, and I think this is significant here, is the anti-government groups have become increasingly anti-Muslim in a way that they haven't been rabidly anti-black in the past. So that is concerning. And the more COVID becomes racialized or seen as a racial thing, we could see them picking up on those strands as this current situation actually reinvigorates their movement.
And let me follow up on that, because one thing that keeps me up at night, and I wondered what you think about it. So even before this pandemic, one of the concerns was looking at the aftermath of the election. For different scenarios, neither of which I could anticipate are good, although none of us have a crystal ball. But what worried me was, on one hand, Trump wins, the dangers are, clear in and of itself. If he loses, especially with the narrative that there's a deep state, that this is, rigged and so forth, the groups that you study clearly are going to buy into that rhetoric. So there was a concern about what they're going to do should Trump lose. Okay, add the layer of the panic, the unemployment, everything else from COVID. It seems that we're going to be in for a very bumpy time potentially. So what else is there to be done to reduce the possibility of that type of it could even potentially be folks pointing guns at each other.
Yeah, I actually agree with you, Ken. It's something I was already worried about the potential of that kind of violence before the pandemic, right? Before COVID, because there's going to be a lot of folks. If Trump were to lose, there's going to be a lot of folks who are going to think the election was rigged, something he might play into. They're going to think it's the end of America. Now, in the pandemic, they're girding themselves for civil war. They're purchasing all kinds of, ammunition and weapons. There's going to be a lot of unhappy people and a lot of desperate people, especially if the economy keeps collapsing. It's, ultimately things like domestic terrorism and whatnot are a law enforcement issue in a big way, but the potential for violence is real here. And it's, I'm concerned about it as well. I'm not exactly sure what is to be done other than to try to stop these ideas from spreading too far within the society, to speak out against it. It's really, really, it's unnerving.
Mhm. And the other part of what you were talking about, I think with Orban, but I think it was generally applicable, that there's a concern about the erosion of democratic institutions, and that is sort of a precondition for the spreading of hate, right? There's implicit in what you were saying, there's a correlation between the strength of a democracy and its capacity to combat hate, both in laws and protecting journalists and so forth. So if part of the strategy from the flows from what you're saying is protecting democracy, what are the additional types of things that you think that we should be doing to make sure that our press is free, that our journalists are free, that our judges are free, and that our representatives, aren't bullied into submission?
Yeah, well, exercising the vote, of course, is the most important, and standing up for the right to vote. That means you have a lot of opportunities to support organizations out there who work on voting rights campaigns and these issues to make sure people can exercise the franchise. I think that's really important. I think it's very important right now, too, that we talk to our elected officials about what we want to see in this society, right? It's not a time to keep your mouth shut, because it was unimaginable to me, as crazy as Orban has been, that he could end up getting these powers, right? It's as though in a blink of an eye something can happen. There's a lot of organizations too, like the Committee to Protect Journalists and so on, that stand up for those rights, and we need to stand up for them too and support these. There's also, frankly, Trump is engaging in sort of a relatively silent war on the entire immigrant population right now, right? Nobody's being allowed in. No refugees are allowed to apply. And as we're all focused on the virus, this is going on. So we have to continue to speak out against all of these things as much as possible.
Right, well, thank you so much, Heidi, for sharing your wisdom and experience with us all. As I said, I'll follow up with you and connect you with the people that asked questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. And I'm really delighted that for the first Bard Center for the Study of Hate webinar, that it's you. So thank you again for your time, and we really appreciate you teaching us.
Thanks, Ken. It was really nice to be here. And thanks to Bard. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Okay, everybody have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.